veterans. So many of them came back. Now, this is a very modest marker, okay? This man was, college graduate, public school teacher. Your brother said your dad was very, very proud of the fact that he was a paratrooper.
He was in pretty much the second wave of D-Day, and he parachuted into occupied France at the time, and he was wounded. Recovered from that, and also went to the Battle of the Bulge, where he got frostbite.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then later on, when the war was over, he ended up touring, unfortunately, some of the now empty concentration camps. So these are, again, so my father's father was a printer, as was my mother. It's interesting those how that literary thing kind of goes through the families.
Well, Jack's father was a printer humble. Also.
Yeah.
Not too far from here, one of my family members buried here, a gentleman named Elfej. Now, it's pronounced Phaneuf here, but we pronounced it Phaneuf, where I come from. But Elfej Phaneuf, he was one of Leo Kerouac's competitors in the print game. But anyhow, this is Edward Sorensen's daughter who showed up for the tour, which is, kind of amazing. Now, I was hoping that the Terry Kerouac Gaudette was going to be here today, Jack's niece. She just had foot surgery. She may not show up, but I'm hoping I would love to have her here, because where we're going to stop the tour, as long as we're able to make enough progress, is at her father's gravesite. And there are almost no Kerouacs buried here. The most famous is Hervé. And I've often wondered, and this is one of the things that you'll discover, you get into the Lowell lore a little bit more. It's like, why more Kerouacs aren't here? Because if you've ever been to Edson Cemetery, not too far from here, that's where Jack is buried. He's buried with his last wife's family. But everyone's like, Jack should be buried up in Nashua with his mother and father and his beloved brother Gerard and his one biological daughter. Or at the very least, because of the concentration of people we have here, he should be buried in this cemetery. This was the Franco-American Catholic cemetery. History back to 1894. Okay, and it took a lot of hard work and a lot of money. By the way, do we have any football fans here? Well, this is just interesting trivia. This is not something that anyone has to know, or I'm going to emphasize a lot on the tour. But the 2 tracts of land that were purchased actually by St. Joseph's Parish in the city for this cemetery. Okay, these used to be privately owned, but they intended to build a summer retreat for the oblates, for the priests. And then Father Guerin, who's really the kind of founder, inventor of this, said, nah, that seems a little exorbitant for us. And, they did have a summer retreat here for a while, but they said, we need a burial ground. Even if you live in a little end of the road, nowhere little village in Quebec, every one of those little towns has a burial ground. They have their own church. So it was important that they actually kind of get this place. Well, anyhow, one of the people that own the land on which we're standing right now at one point in time is the Sullivan family. The Sullivans were also printers, and Billy Sullivan was the original owner of the New England Patriots. So, you got to be very careful, by the way, because I'm a native New Yorker. I try not to talk too much about sports while I'm here, because people are like, well. So anyhow, so guys, the reason we came over here is not just because, Edward's daughter's here, but last year, okay, the tour, we did one section of the cemetery. I thought, change things up this year. So we were going to do a completely different section, might not have come over here. So for those of you who walked over here with us, we just wanted to get a look at that. And by the way, I have all these mnemonic devices I use to try to remember where things are. So anyhow, so Edward Sorensen, the first of Jack Kerouac's friends, the one he met the earliest that makes any appearance in any of his books. This guy right here. And again, you're going to see the theme, a lot of veterans, but also you're not going to see very many impressive, like super duper big kind of gravestones. These are all modest, hardworking, working class folks. They're educators. These people worked, plumbers, carpenters, we have people who were lawyers, we have people who were accountants, we have people who worked at the, State House B in Boston. You have people from a broad range of things, but it's remarkable how modest most of the stones are for these folks. So these are the lifeblood of Jack Kerouac's books. And for those of you who only know Jack Kerouac based on something like On the Road, you're going to hear me mention On the Road basically for the last time, just a few seconds ago. I'm going to be talking about Visions of Girard, which, if you know anything about the St. Louis de France parish, that book, literally, there's like about a 4 or 5 block wide area there. The entire book takes place there. And Kerouac lovingly describes places and people and happenings there, and has captured a kind of smaller, a minor history that otherwise would probably be lost to us. He did the same thing for Pawtucketville in his book Dr. Sachs. He does kind of more the wider scope of Lowell in books like The Town and the City, which is the first book he ever had published, and one called The Vanity of Duluoz, which was the last book that was published in his lifetime. He wrote it while he was living here in Lowell, in the Highlands, in 1967. So this is a guy who, the best of his books, and by the way, Jack Kerouac's 2 favorite books of his, Visions of Girard, which if you've never read it, that is one of the most beautiful but painfully sad books you will ever read. It's about his older brother's, basically, saintly behavior. It's kind of a biography, a hagiography of a sort, but his beatitude, or the kind of beatific nature about him, but also it leads and concludes with the boy's death at age 9, and that impacted Jack so greatly. So the book that is probably the most delicate and the most perfect, every single word in the right place. It's a little bit different from some of his books. It's not very experimental, but his Visions of Girard. So that was one of his favorite books, and Dr. Sachs was his Lowell books. There's nothing wrong with the Dharma Bums and Desolation Angels. There's nothing wrong with, On the Road and, any of the better known books. But Jack's heart was always with Lowell, and it kind of pains me that more folks don't read those books. Difficult as they sometimes are to read, but if you know anything about Lowell history and Lowell's people, you're going to recognize someone or someplace in those books. So we'll make our way back over to, I'm assuming the bus will be coming, hopefully coming pretty soon, but we have more than enough people to start. I just don't want to delay things. We might as well, just for the sake of argument, kind of get started. So let's go in this over by the shade tree here, which is very close to where we're going to actually start our walk.
So
now,
did you get to meet him?
I don't want to burden anybody with doing this, but at some point, if I go to now, believe it or not, it's like I figured we need visuals, right? Old school teacher. So I actually have this, and this has photographs of people, places, things that are worth, amplifying upon here. The Lowell Sun is a wonderful resource for lots and lots of information about the people, whose graves we're going to be visiting here today. So let's go over here so I can get started, get my tablet turned on so you can get things moving. For LCK. If you are at all interested, there is a lineup chock full of great things going on here for the 2024 Lowell Celebrates Kerouac Festival. We've got renowned beat scholar Matt Theotto, who's going to be speaking at Lala Books on Market Street, 2 o'clock this afternoon. Matt is all the way here from Japan, where he lives. We also have a great, it's called Use Poetry or Use Poetry. I'm not sure, I haven't consulted with the folks. At 5 o'clock today. So most of the events for LCK are free. I will tell you, if at the end of the tour, and please don't, start handing me money or anything like that before that, because the tour may stink. You may go, oh, wow, that was a ripoff. Okay, so
we can guarantee it.
If you want to contribute, LCK, the committee, this is a non-profit thing. People do this because of love of Kerouac, their Lowell heritage. I dedicate every one of the tours that I do to Roger Brunell. Roger Brunell was my mentor. Roger passed in 2021. He was basically the architect of the walking tours for Lowell, and he made such a strong impression on me. I said, I have to do this. And one of the reasons we're here first is that this is a tour that I kind of came up with myself based on a couple of points of influence. First off, when I was a kid, I really loved this collection of poems called A Spoon River Anthology by Edgar Lee Masters. And the book is narrated by dead people, or at least by their epitaphs, because each of the poems are written as an epitaph. So it ends up being this collective of voices for people in this one small town, live right alongside Spoon River. And I thought, boy, that's interesting, the thought that we could tell the town's story, okay, for people who passed on. And some of the stories don't mesh, and some of them bring up scandals within the town, and some of them talk about the small tragedies that are often overlooked. Sometimes there are great moments of ebullience and triumph, but I thought, I love that book. Well, another of my favorite books is one written by a New York native named William Kennedy. William Kennedy is a lifetime resident of the city of Albany, New York, and most of his best books are written about Albany. And one of them is called Ironweed. Ironweed was turned into an award-nominated film with Jack Nicholson playing the lead. But Ironweed is the story of this Depression-era kind of stumble bum, alcoholic, who comes back to his hometown and has a series of experiences which begins with him going to the cemetery where his family members are buried. And it dredges up all these old memories. And how Kennedy starts the book is pretty amazing. The dead laying in the ground can see the living. So, you know, this guy, Francis Phelan is his name, his parents can see him moving. His infant son, who he dropped when he was just a few months old and died right there. So the book is just filled with all these haunting kind of reflections on, which of these people, the guy who's standing on the earth or the people under is more alive at this point. But anyhow, the book uses that trope of like the dead still having something to say to us. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. I wonder if that would work for Kerouac. So I first came here looking for a single grave. I now have over 75 individual graves and sets of people that I've researched who all happen to be characters in Jack's books. Books like Visions of Gerard, Dr. Sachs, The Town and the City. One of my favorite lesser Kerouac works, it's called Memory Babe, and I hope more people read it because it really is splendid. It's unfinished, and it was the first thing that Kerouac started writing after the success of On the Road. He was so shaken up by the success around that book that he retreated to Lowell, which was something he often did. So you have this stew pot of influences, and I was like, well, wonder what I can do with this. Well, and it's just something I started doing over a decade ago, and when I finally said, I think I've got enough information to share with people who might similarly be taphophiles. I'm a taphophile. I am a lover of cemeteries. So whenever I'm here in Lowell, I spend time here. I walk the grounds here. It's one of my favorite things to do. I forego, attendance at other Kerouac events so I can spend time here with people I feel like I've gotten to know quite well. So to start, a couple of short quotes from Jack, and I love this one. When I am an old man, I'll at least have my jug of wine, my loaf of bread, and my Lowell kingdom of the mind. Lowell colonized his mind in all of these profound ways. I mean, Jack Kerouac is sitting on the top of Desolation Peak in the Upper Cascades, and one day his mind just starts wandering, and he jots this down in his book. He starts thinking of his old buddy, Joe Fortier, it's actually Michel Fournier, okay, who lived on Salem Street, and he starts thinking about his friend, the house. It triggers this whole series of associations for him. So he never got Lowell out of his mind. Here's another short one that I want to read for you. This is a little bit longer. This was published in the Lowell Sun in 1962 when Jack was correspondent with a woman named Mary Sampis. Okay, Jack's last wife was a woman named Stella Sampis. Stella Sampis and Charlie Sampis were brother and sister. Well, Charlie, his wife, is Mary Sampis. she had a column in the Lowell Sun called her Pertinax column. So Jack wrote this to her, and it was published in 1962. It says, "I love Lowell for the golden-domed Greek Orthodox Church of the Holy Trinity on the canal, only a stone's throw from the dives of the tortured, sad hearts of life and death. And I love Lowell for St. John Baptiste rising above the rooftops of Moody Street in a dream, when on winter nights in the wash courts, the stiff clothes crack and try to flap. I also love Lowell for St. Louis de France in Centerville, where I was baptized and where my brother was buried in a coffin as 100 little boys sang on a rainy day, and we carted him off in a procession to Nashville, New Hampshire, and when he was lowered in the ground, everybody cried, except me. I was 4 years old and I thought, he was in heaven, and what was there to cry about? I love Lowell, and it's all an old hat, but if I ever retire from this life, my face will be bent over you all." So Jack adored Lowell. He never stopped thinking about it, never stopped writing about it. And in fact, for those people who kind of base his reputation on a few months of bad behavior in the 1960s when he was very clearly in an alcoholic decline, I said, go back to his first book. Go back to his first book. This will tell you how he feels about Lowell. Now in this passage, which is from his first novel, The Town and the City, he renames Lowell Galloway. There were concerns about like libel, and it's like, oh, you know, somebody getting painted in a bad light. So Jack changes the name of Lowell to Galloway. But this is one of the opening passages in The Town and the City. One of the most beautiful things Jack ever wrote. "If at night a man goes out to the woods surrounding Galloway and stands on a hill, he can see it all there before him in broad panorama. The river coursing slowly in an arc, the mills with their long rows of windows all aglow, the factory stacks rising higher than the church steeples. But he knows that this is not the true Galloway. Something in the invisible, brooding landscape surrounding the town, something in the bright stars nodding close to a hillside where the old cemetery sleeps, something in the soft, swishing tree leaves over the fields and stone walls tells him a different story." And I guess if, you know, I can preface, you know, the beginning of our tour with saying, what I hope you're going to hear are a collection of different stories or ones you might not have heard before as we move around. So let's head off this way. We're going to be in section VA over here.
Very over there. Yeah. No.
Okay, so folks, the first grave we're stopping at here is for a gentleman named Leo Carafel. Leo Carafel and his wife, Florence, were married for 60 years. Leo worked for decades at Colonial Gas. He was a Marine veteran of World War II. He was really quite an interesting guy. Had a large family, as most French-Canadian families kind of were at the time. He makes it into Jack Kerouac's book, Vanity of Duluoz, for a bit of bad behavior. So this is an interesting place to start our tour. Leo Carafel is renamed Halmelo. And in the book Vanity of Duluoz, Jack and his friends have a sandlot football game going on. And Jack, for those of you who don't know, was a high school football star. World-class sprint speed, okay? And he developed a lot of those skills and talents very, very early. So he's only 13 years old at the time this incident happens. Well, Leo Carafel was playing on the other team and gave Jack a couple of cheap shots. When Jack finally got tackled, Leo Carafel was punching Jack in the face. So get that little Christ of a Kerouac, okay? Well, Leo Kerouac, Jack's dad, was there on the side and just going apoplectic. Well, Jack decided not to retaliate right away, but a little later in the game, he hit a tackle. He hit a flying tackle on Leo Carafel that actually knocked him out of the game because he was dazed so badly. They think there maybe had been a little bit of a problem. Leo Carafel had been thrown out of the Pawtucketville Social Club one night for, you know, maybe being a little too insistent. He was too young really to be drinking, but there were a lot of too young drinking that went on there. So anyhow, Leo Carafel makes it And whether he ever knew he made it to one of Jack's books or not, it's probably better if he didn't know, because it's not a very flattering portrait of him. But anyhow, Leo Carafel, folks. Roland Salvis. Now, we're not going to stop here. We'll be stopping at his grave later. But this is his younger brother, Rene, who also makes it into one of Jack's books. He says, he's my friend Lousy. By the way, Lousy was the nickname he gave his friend Roland. He said, he's my friend Lousy's strange-looking younger brother. I've seen photographs of him, and I don't think he looks particularly strange, but I'm not sure what Jack might have been judging or assessing. Now, there's some connections between Charles Dickens and Jack Kerouac, and if I can say that there is a Dickensian story that I'm going to tell today here, it's for the next grave, which is right at the edge of this little section up here. In fact, if you're aiming for it, it looks like there's still a lot of flowers around it. So that'll be our next grave.
Now, how did you gain all this detailed information about the childhood friends and, you know, fights and football games and...
Reading, really carefully, very carefully reading Jack's books.
Yeah.
Confirming what I could using census records, archival photographs, resident directories, columns, bits and pieces of writing from local newspapers.
Have you written your own book about this?
That's an excellent question. I haven't, but the whole reason I haven't is I'm not really interested in publishing. If the only form that my research ever takes is doing tours like this, I'll be happy. So.
Yeah, well, you do. You have a lot of insight.
I mean, you could even do like an audiobook.
One of my favorite graves that we're going to visit today is for this gentleman, Armand Gautier. Armand Gautier, by the time he was age 11, he'd lost his father in 1912 to tuberculosis. He'd lost two younger sisters, one to measles and one to pneumonia, and he lost his mother, to an unnamed illness. So it was just him and his brother who remained in the family, and they spent a year in the Franco-American orphanage in town, if you know where that is, near the grotto. So not a great start to his life. His mother did manage to remarry after the father died, but that marriage only lasted a year before the mother died. And the gentleman who was his stepfather said, I can't take care of you. He dumped him in an orphanage in Quebec. So Armand Gautier spent time in 2 orphanages in 2 countries, real hard scrabble stuff. The story about him actually having to cross a section of the St. Lawrence, you know, frozen in the wintertime to get from point A to point B. It's pretty heartbreaking stuff. So the fact that he survived to adulthood at all is amazing. But he didn't just survive until adulthood. He actually ultimately ended up being a proud husband. He was married to his wife Aurea for 59 years. He fathered 6 children. And because of all of the illness in his life early on, he started working out. He started being a kind of a bodybuilder, a figure of, of great strength. And I just realized, by the way, I left all of my pictures back against. You got it. Wonderful. There's a picture in here. You are a rescuer. I want to show you guys this picture, or some of these pictures.
He gets the hero award.
Oh, absolutely.
Figured you'd want it later.
Of course, this is not Armand Gautier. This is Jack Kerouac. These are the 2 Jack Kerouacs that, you have to wrestle with in today's presentation. This is high school graduate Kerouac. This is Kerouac in 1964, not looking like a high school graduate at all. Here he is at his first book signing. But anyhow, here's Armand Gautier. Armand Gautier became an excellent boxer. Here he is with his friend over here. Again, the photos are blurry. These are kind of low-resolution snaps. He worked out a lot, lifted weights, did all those things to make his body really, really healthy. And also, having suffered all that tragedy early on, he ended up being just really, really composed human being. I've listened to audio interviews with him in the Mogan Center, and he's just he exudes this sense of serenity. It's like this guy had pretty much seen it all. By the way, Armand Gauthier was also a professional wrestler. His sponsor was a guy named Leo Kerouac, Jack's father. So he had some success on the local wrestling circuit, but he was a very gentle man by disposition, so he didn't stick with that for long, although he did go into business with Leo Kerouac, kind of running the gym for a while. He also worked for Leo Kerouac as a printer's assistant, okay? And here's probably the best photo I have of the Kerouac family. This is Leo Kerouac, his wife Gabrielle, Jack's older sister Caroline, and this is a very little Jack Kerouac. I estimate this photo is from 1929 or 1930. The gentleman right here is Armand Gauthier. He became the unofficial chauffeur for the family. He also ultimately became a manager of the Merrimack rug store here in town. He worked there for 37 years. I interviewed a couple of his family members who were really generous in sharing resources with me, and I got to tell you, I haven't heard a person say a single bad word of him. He seems like one of the most genuinely beloved people that I've ever met. And I'm glad to have gotten to meet him through Kerouac's fiction. In fact, Kerouac describes him at one point, how he and his sister, his biceps were so big, he would put his arms out like this and he would let the Kerouac kids swing on his arms. And Jack said, "What a build, just like Mr. America." Okay, so he was one of the first kind of physical role models for Jack, who was a kind of a sensitive, reticent boy, but seeing like kind of a masculine role model, someone who wasn't like uber masculine, someone who wasn't like that kind of toxic masculinity. So Armand, this is one of my favorite places. I always come here when I'm in the cemetery. I wish I had really genuinely wish I'd gotten a chance to meet him.
And here's a little footnote. One of his sons just died. I think it leaves 2 sisters now, maybe. I can send you the obituary.
Wait, it's not Chuck, is it? Because Chuck, I've been corresponding with his, well, wait.
No,
yeah, his grandson.
That would be a grandson. No,
okay, all right.
This is one of the sons. I think his name is John, but I'll look up his obituary. It was just in the past month.
By the way, for whoever asked the question, like, how do you find out stuff? Obituaries are also, I mean, I hope it doesn't sound ghoulish, but, you know, I had obituaries for every single one of the people on the tour today because they're wealths of information. And what they choose to tell you and what they choose not to tell you also can be very, you know, informative.
When you say pro wrestling, you mean the theatrical style, or before the theatrical style?
Wrestling?
Yeah.
It was actually in the day what we call theatrical. It wasn't Greco-Roman, but they were out for blood at the time. So it wasn't. So
it's closer to MMA.
It's much closer to MMA, and that's one of the reasons why he didn't do it for long. All right. Now, I hope this juxtaposition of photos doesn't seem irreverent. I don't intend it to be. But, okay, I'm assuming most of you know who we're looking at here. Okay, so this is what do these pictures have in common? This is the first one. Okay. Come around here. This is the second one. You guys recognize the person in the middle there? We just talked about the Franco-American orphanage, which later became the Franco-American school. This is Jacqueline Kennedy visiting the Franco-American school in 1959. Okay, so hopefully you're going, what the heck does that have to do with the Three Stooges? Okay. Here's another photograph, more of a close-up. Any of you recognize the gentleman on the left?
JFK.
Well, I'll tell you what, he wishes that is Father Spike.
Yeah.
Oh,
Armand Spike Morissette,
Yes.
who was the gentleman who did Jack Kerouac's funeral service, okay, and was provided early tutelage to Jack that was encouraged Jack to become a writer. Now,
Is that what Father Morissette Boulevard is named after?
Yeah, that's exactly who it's named after. In fact, his grave is at the top of the hill, not too far from where we're standing. Here's another photograph. Some locals may recognize a couple more of the people here. Obviously, we have Jackie Kennedy. This right here, he would become Jack's brother-in-law. That's Charles Sampis. And there's Charles Sampis's wife, Mary Bootsellis Sampis. Okay, at that same event. And this was some kind of fundraiser for John F. Kennedy. All right. Now we have a very different kind of photo. This is an aerial photo of Little Canada, which no longer exists. It was raised in the 1960s in the name of urban redevelopment. And you have, I've got it right here, some of Lowell Textile University, and you got the old Moody Street Bridge. Okay. So you think, you know what the connection is to this point? And by the way, here's another one of Little Canada being torn down. Okay, I believe 1964 is the date on this. Okay.
Is it George Poirier who's the photographer of everything?
Very good. The gentleman right in the middle here, they're very handsome. Looks a bit like, you know, like Cary Grant. Got that kind of movie star look. This is Mr. George Poirier. Okay. Who should be called like Lon Chaney was called the Man of 1,000 Faces, and Mel Blanc from Warner Brothers called the Man of 1,000 Voices. He should be called the Man of 1,000,000 Photos, because he took over 1,000,000 photos in his lifetime. Every single one of the pictures that you saw, those were taken by him. The pictures he was better known for were the ones he took of families. You know, it could be baptisms, graduations, weddings. Okay, and this is his George of Lowell photography studio, which he started with his wife in the early 1950s.
On University Ave. Right?
Yeah, very good, very good. And here's another photo he took. And we have to contend with the fact that this is the Jack Kerouac that most people know about from the 1960s. This was taken in March of 1964. This is Jack Kerouac sitting next to the owner of the Celebrity Lounge, whose name is Manny Bello, who, for folks who know about Manny, at least I think one folk back here knows a little bit about Manny Bello. Yeah, I won't say anything other than he was somewhat infamous. Okay, but this is the Jack Kerouac that most people and a lot of folks who were around at this time know. The drunken, slovenly Jack Kerouac, the one who, you know, was a stumble bum. Now, the whole time he was living in Lowell, he was still writing. Like I said, he published his last book. Okay, that was written here in town.
Kurt?
Yeah.
About how old is he in that picture?
Okay, so this would be 1964. So at this point, Jack is 42. He doesn't look 42. He looks much older. I'm always reminded of the anecdote about Charlie Parker when the medical examiner looked at his body and reported that he was looking at a deceased African-American male of approximately 65 years of age. Oh. Charlie Parker was 34 when he died. So this is Jack with George Poirier. And this is his headstone, which of course features a camera up there. Another World War II veteran. This guy had more interest than I could possibly list. He made his own beer, refurbished like antique cars. He was an incredible singer. In fact, he performed at Boston Symphony Hall with Nashua's barbershop quartet. So a really, really interesting guy. But George is at least part of why we think of Jack Kerouac as a bum, in a way, because he snapped these photos, indelible though they are and important though they are. That's part of the legacy he leaves us with. I hope most people think of him for the, 999,998 other photos he took as opposed to.
Kurt, I found the obituary for Jean Gauthier, John Gauthier, born in Lowell on October 16, 1942, a son of the late Armand and Aurea.
Yeah.
Is that the one?
Aurea,
yeah.
That's
Gauthier. Yeah. He was a truck driver for most of his career. Before his retirement, he was employed at Lowell Regional Transit Authority. He was in love with cars, was a member of the Roadrunner Club or something like that. Yeah.
Well,
so
again, even folks like this guy who was something of celebrity. By the way, he took photographs of every entertainer. If Betty Davis was in town, took photographs of her, Danny Thomas, all of the religious leaders of town, every politician of any kind of renown, you know, whether it's Tsongas or Dukakis, any of these people. He also took pictures of every Lowell mayor from basically about 1951, 1952 on. So he was, you know, he was famous as a photographer here. Pretty modest grave. You know, I'm hoping the photographs that were taken there, you know, that he would look at them and go, these are okay photographs, you know, especially since they're what represent him. Let's head over here, guys. The next person we're going to talk about a little bit is someone who has a historical marker for him placed at the intersection of two streets in Pawtucketville. Oh, thank you very much. I'd have forgotten my...
Kurt?
Just making sure I had hands on because that was grave of Robert O. Hood. Jack Kerouac renames him Jean Plouffe in his Lowell novels. In fact, he and his brothers, okay, four of whom served in World War II, are all characters in Lowell's book. His mother was, his father was, and this guy's pretty outstanding. Not just in the fact that, like, he's a character in Jack's books. He was also a decorated World War II veteran, spent 7 months in captivity in a Stalag 7A just outside of Munich, Germany during World War II. He managed to escape, and one of the things that allowed him to kind of successfully escape from captivity, and by the way, he said the work at the cemetery, the work at the Stalag wasn't all that difficult. So, but the fact that they put us at night in these train cars, which happened to be really, really good targets for, like, you know, British and American planes. He's like, I knew I was probably going to end up dying the result of friendly fire if I wasn't careful. So after 7 months, he'd had enough. He and another guy left because he was fluent in French, not Parisian French, but Lowell French. He was actually able to make contact with a member of the French resistance, who provided him with clothes and provided his comrade with clothes and the necessary papers that he kind of made it out. But his stories about his time, and made a feature article in the Lowell newspapers. So pretty amazing. Well, when he came back from his wartime experience, he never lost a beat. He'd been a local sporting star. He played in the Lowell what is called the Twilight League or the Twi League. He played CYO baseball. In fact, the first thing I have about him, just jottings, okay, from the Lowell Sun 1940. Mike and Pete Hood, his nickname is Pete. Former Twi League players are still seeing plenty of baseball action despite the fact that they are in the service. Mike is starring at second base for the U.S. Army Air Corps Club at Fairfield, California, while Pete is playing the infield for the Fort Leonard Wood Club outside St. Louis. Now, there's also a mention of Skippy Roberge in here, who's a Major League Baseball player, one of two that I know of from Lowell, who happen to be good friends with Pete Hood. And this is the article about his escape. It's really great if you get interested in trying to look this up. It's one of those things you read and you go, how did anyone survive these kinds of experiences? The fear itself would have been enough to kind of drive you crazy. But once he was out, he was involved in every civic, ethnic, and kind of community organization here in Lowell that he could be in charge of. He was the head of the 1975 Franco-American Week committee. He served on licensing committees. He was a member of he had ceremonial memberships in all of the ethnic clubs, all of the private social clubs here. He was a celebrity. And one of the things I love so much about this guy, when he gave interviews to Jerry Nicosia for part of the Kerouac biography that he wrote, he was the most articulate, easiest to confirm. If he said something, I had the easiest time finding some corroboration of the kinds of things he was saying. But he had delightful things to say about Jack, and, you know, he said, like I often say, I really wish more people knew about the Jack that we learned to love growing up with him, because he was such a sweet kid, sensitive to a fault, incredible athlete, and you don't have to look far. There are pictures of Robert Hood all over the Lowell papers for one thing or another. In fact, the last picture I have of him is when he and members of the St. Jean d'Arc, he was a lifetime resident of Pawtucketville, okay, veterans of a championship game that was from 1947. Well, 1983 they got together, and here he is. And by the way, his brother, whose grave is a little ways down the road, was also on that same team. Now, I'm not going to spend quite as much time talking about him, but if you turn around here and look, there's a grave right there that says Malo, or Mallow, depending on how it's pronounced. I've heard it pronounced both ways. This is a not very good picture of him, of Alcide Malo, another World War II veteran, working class guy. He worked for C.G. Sargent for a number of decades. This picture is taken from this iconic photograph of Jack Kerouac at his 17th birthday. This was published in the Lowell Courier, okay? And this is Mary Carney, who would be renamed Maggie Cassidy in Jack's most romantic, his book about doomed adolescent love. This is the birthday party that his sister Caroline gave for him. This is Alcide Malo, who Jack used to play ball with, okay? This is Roland Salvis, who we'll hear about a little bit later. But anyhow, Jack talks about this specific photo. He does a pretty interesting analysis of their facial expressions here. So this is Alcide Malo, who was kind of on the periphery of Jack's group of friends, but he was also friends with Caroline Kerouac, so he ends up at the famous birthday party, which Jack really wasn't all that interested in because there happened to be a couple of guys at the party who also had a romantic interest in Mary Carney. So if Jack's looking a little pensive there, it's because he is. And he was always embarrassed by the photo, except for, I think, the kind of Grecian hair. He was really kind of proud of that. So let's move on here. Let me make sure I got my bearings. I'm trying to figure out who some of the characters in your book are because I'm interested in those influences. Jack actually sent her a list of who the names of the actual people were. He let her guess who some of them were, and he wouldn't name who some of them were because some of the stuff he says verges on being libelous. Sometimes it's, well, that's kind of an embarrassing story. You stole what? All the football helmets. Probably shouldn't mention that in public. Now, our next grave here is for a gentleman named Omer Deschanel. Omer Deschanel ran Deschanel, along with his brother, Deschanel Brothers, Milk and Dairy. You'll notice he died rather young. It's only 49 when he died. I want to show you a picture of Omer with his family. Now, see if you can tell me maybe one of the reasons why he died young. This is Omer, his wife, okay, who's on here, Laura, and his 12 children.
Oh, that's nothing. 15.
There are lots and lots of the families kind of featured in the tour in some fashion. 10, 15 kids, not uncommon. I mean, everyone there is potentially a worker. Now, I did want to address just a little bit more this gentleman right here. Okay, that is Arthur Deschanel. Now, he's not buried here in this cemetery. Okay. Oh, by the way, there's Omer doing something he really, really liked to do. I'm not sure if that's a sturgeon or what that is, but that is a big, big fish. And I'm not sure that I could pull that in even if I had 3 other people helping me. Just a couple of photos of Deschanel brothers here. Milk. This is Arthur and his wife, new wife, Jean Bergeron. Okay, and it turns out if you look at the accompanying article that ran with the photograph from Jack's birthday party, 2 of the people in attendance were Arthur Deschanel and Jeanette Bergeron. They weren't together at the time because Mary Carney had taken a fancy to Arthur Deschanel. So, like I said, there was a certain amount of competition there. Now, I don't know if it's when they were there when they met, but they ultimately did marry. And again, all of this just, you know, kind of sort of kerfuffle comes from the Lowell Sun, okay? Arthur Deschanel died in Germany on September 30th, 1944. He was one of 5 children. So 5 of the young men you saw in that family photo served, I mean, we're talking Saving Private Ryan type stuff here, okay? Died, and he was a member of George Patton's 3rd Division, I believe, Army. So never got to have kids. In fact, he's buried in, I got the right page here. He's buried in Luxembourg. Okay. Now, in Maggie Cassidy, Jack renames the Deschanel family the Rousseau family. Calls them, you know, milk barons. Okay. And I think that's probably because he was feeling a little testy about the presence of this one guy at the park. But he's one of a great number of people, and Jack would later reflect both in his kind of his correspondence to people, but also when he would write about his experience of Jack was haunted by all of the loss that he saw come out of this town during World War II. And Jack, of course, had a failed experiment in the Navy. He lasted just a couple of months because he couldn't adjust to military discipline. He got thrown in, you know, what was called the booby hatch at the time, because he wasn't going to, why am I going to do these marching drills? Is no, couldn't do it. He says, I'm Samuel Johnson. I don't have to, you know, I mean, he just, you know, probably postured himself as being a little crazier than he was, but he was formally diagnosed as having dementia praecox, which is schizophrenia. Now, would that hold up under any kind of scrutiny? I'm not sure, but I can tell you this. The fact that Jack never served in the military would later haunt him, especially when one by one so many of his friends were died or were injured. Ed Sorensen was injured in World War II. At least 2 of his best friends were killed in World War II. He never got over those. He dedicates an entire book called The Haunted Life to 2 of his friends who died in World War II. So I think he had survivor's guilt, pretty serious survivor's guilt. And Jack did very important work. He wrote about all of this stuff. He chronicled. But in the eyes of a lot of Lowellians, that's one of the reasons they also, after his failure to take off and become a professional football star, that's why his failures as a soldier were that much more magnified. Because it seemed like this guy's not good at anything. Because it took until the early 1950s for him to get his first book published, and 6 years after that to get the most famous book he would ever publish. And then those books went out of print so quickly, most people regard Jack Kerouac's life a study in failure that he never overcame. He was a lazy bum. I got to tell you, I've done a lot of reading in the archive here in town, the Jack Kerouac archive. If he was lazy, I wish I were half that lazy, because the amount of writing he did in his lifetime was mammoth. And the fact that all of his books are now in print, and more of them are being published every day, including one of our speakers here this year is here to talk about a new collection of writings called Self-Portrait, which is amazing. Amazing collection of writing, and that's the tip of the iceberg of things that haven't been published with Jack's. So Jack didn't die quite as early a death as Arthur Deschanel did, but he still felt very acutely that all of that absence, that he felt like I didn't do my part. So let's make our way a little bit farther back here.
Marines or...
Yeah.
And did you happen to see the play that they, the Kerouac play that they did at the Merrimack Rep a few years ago?
Yeah, it was called The Haunted Life.
The Haunted Life. That's it. You said that. I'm like, okay, now that's coming back to me. That was interesting. I actually enjoyed that a lot. I know other people didn't, but...
Well, look, one of the things that book kind of unearthed is that Jack's father could be a very, very, very bilious man.
Yes.
He absolutely hated Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yeah.
And was how do I put this? He said some ethnically very, very suspect things that were anti-Semitic, things that were incredibly racist in some respect. And Jack unearths all of that in this play. So some people didn't like it because they thought it cast a bad light on Jack. I said all it does is help explain the complexity of where he came from ideologically.
What was ironic is that they cast a black woman as his father's wife. So that was a strange kind of interesting.
Well, and they probably did that to provoke those discussions. Okay, folks, I just want to stop here. Okay, the gentleman we're going to talk about here, his name is Robert P. Grondin, okay? Died actually very suddenly while he was visiting family in Quebec. Most of the people we're talking about here, if they themselves weren't born in Quebec, the generation prior to them likely was. Another World War II veteran, another Sandlot football mate of Jack's. But I did just want to point out, Jack often gives his characters very fanciful and interesting nicknames. So Robert Grondin's nickname was Biz, B-I-Z, Robert Biz Grondin. Jack renames him in his book, Vanity of Duluoz, Bong, B-O-N-G, Bong Baudouin. You gotta like the alliteration there, but has nothing to do with any kind of reference to recreational, kind of intoxicants. But he was such a fierce tackler. In fact, Jack had recruited him to play in a Sandlot football team to keep people from Leo Carafel from knocking Jack's head off, I guess, or something. But I've always loved the fact of some of Jack's things. Jack renames characters all kinds of very funny things. There's a lady named Marie Laflamme, who's buried not too far from us here. He renames her Flu Flap, which I've always thought, I guess he just liked the sound of the word. Those aren't even the best of his names, but a couple of those I'll save for a little bit farther down the road because they're part of what we're going to talk about. Jack was a great fan of movies. Some people read his more experimental books and go, I don't get the sudden changes in focus. He will jump from one event to the next. Jack was doing things like kind of cinematic juxtaposition, okay, kind of montage style editing within his own right, strongly influenced by cinema because as a kid, his father did a lot of the printing for local theaters, and Jack got free tickets to whatever movie theater he wanted to go to. Kind of a sweet deal when you think about it. So we're here at this grave for someone named Henry Pitre because of Jack's love of movies. His favorite Lowell movie theater was the old Royal Theater on Merrimack Street.
Oh, no.
Because I'm walking along the same route.
Yeah. Nah, I'm good.
Okay.
And Jack used to like to go into this theater, into what was the unofficial, like, segregated kind of balcony area, which had a racially very inappropriate name at the time. But Jack and his sister, or Jack and his friends, used to like to go up there because they kind of kept out of the line of sight of the usher. Well, the usher at the Royal Theater at the time was Henry Pitre. What makes that the least bit interesting? Well, Henry Pitre used to scare the kids because he'd lost an arm in an accident in one of the Lowell mills, okay? And he had a claw that he could kind of click and do this thing with. So he would come after the kids with the flashlight and say, "You, shut up." And Jack actually mentions this. He's like sitting there with his sister one day and he would come up, and it got to the point they kind of found it really not threatening at all, just kind of, just almost, it's part of the program here. But he gets a mention in one of Jack's books. This guy who worked as an usher, because really there wasn't a lot of other work that he could be doing because of the physically grueling work in the mills at the time. So Henry Pitre, who by the way was also friendly with his dad and lived in a house about 2 or 3 down from where Roger Brunel used to live on Campage Street. Roger Brunel, kind of the founder of the tours that we're doing here today. So I like to mention him just because, one, I also love movies, but the fact that Jack mentions the movie Usher because there was this kind of gothic detail that he just found so interesting. Jack likes eccentricity, and he features that, lots of his descriptions of characters. So, all right, let's just a quick nod here, folks, to the grave of Victor J. LeBlanc. If you notice his age, Jack was born in 1922, so he's 5 years older, but he was part of that circle of friends that Jack used to play with. In Pawtucketville, at the time that Jack lived there were two streets in Pawtucketville he lived on. He lived on Phoebe Avenue and Sarah Avenue. And at the time, both of those were still dirt roads. They were dirt streets, they weren't paved. So there was a whole area both in front of Phoebe Avenue, kind of off to the east of Phoebe Avenue, that the neighborhood kids called the Sandbank or the Sandbanks. And they go there and play games like army and soldier games and things like that. Well, some of the older kids used to don, if not so much disguises, but don persona and kind of become the bad guys. Well, one of the bad guy characters in Jack's childhood play was known as the Moon Man. Okay, and the Moon Man would often climb up, and you wouldn't see him up there until he'd come jumping out of the tree, or he'd howl in the tree. One of the tricks that somebody in the neighborhood learned was how to actually put gasoline in his mouth and then spit it out with a lighted match and make this impressive display. And the kids would go running. Okay, one of the about 2 or 3 different kids who played the Moon Man in the neighborhood. Now, Robert Hood, whose grave we visit, used to occasionally do it, but the person they talk about having done it more often was Victor LeBlanc. So I don't think it foreshortened his life at all that he ingested gasoline, but it is worth considering if that's probably the best way to spend your recreation. At the grave here of another one of the Hood family, 10 children in this family. We aren't going to visit the grave today of his younger brother Roland, but both Henry and Robert's younger brother Roland died when he was just 17 years of age. Horrible accident. He was helping deliver milk in the neighborhood, and milk was being delivered at the time by horse-drawn cart. This was in 1938. Well, it was considered something of like a distinction, like, you know, it's like, I get to help the milkman. The milkman is a young fellow named Ernest Beauchesne, who's also buried here. But anyhow, his younger brother Roland went to jump on the milk truck to grab another bottle of milk, because while they were delivering the milk, the horse would slowly keep walking. So like the horse had the routine down just as well as the human being driving the horse-drawn cart. Well, young Roland Hood went to get up the milk cart, and his foot slipped on this little small step. It got tangled in the spokes of the wooden wheel. The horse panicked when he started kind of crying out, and the horse took off. Dragged him, just about tore the back of his foot off. And what's awful about this is that Jack and his friends witnessed this because they were outside the house on Sarah Avenue at the time that this happened. So another death, young death, had nothing to do with the war, although he likely would have gone to war himself. So the younger brother died under these tragic circumstances because the foot never healed properly, got gangrene, and he was dead. Okay. So the Hood family had a lot of tragedy in it. Now, fortunately for us, Henry Hood, whose nickname was Mike, is not one of the more tragic stories. His is actually one of what I consider to be great triumph. Now, hopefully I can find the picture for you here. Sure. Is it earlier? Well, the whole reason I want to share anything at all about him is not that we need to hear more about the Hood family again, but if you look back here, his wife, Alice, and I have a lovely photograph of them. Maybe I'll just find it on my tablet for you because I really would like you to see it. Alice Hood, who was born Alice Dubois, and Henry Hood got married in 1951. At the time they were married, she was still working in the mills. She was one of the last surviving of all the mill girls in Lowell. She worked for 42 years. And she deserves a shout out for that, because if you know anything about the grueling nature of the work in the mills, she is someone who definitely needs to get her props. So let me see if I can find this photograph for you here. I'm going the wrong direction there. Yes, there we go. Somebody is a little obsessive when it comes to collecting pictures. I'm not going to say who that is, but all right. Well, I can't seem to find it here, but if if I track it down, it'll probably turn. Oh, here it is, right here. Okay. Let's see. I got to get my screen to stop from turning, though. Give me just a moment. It's such a nice picture, too, and that's why I want you to see it. Oops. Oh. There we go. Let me get the screen now. Of course, I should probably just have the screen frozen anyhow, because I'm only reading in portrait. All right. And there we go. Auto-rotate screen stop. There we go. All right, so anyhow, this is a photograph of Henry E. Mike Hood and his wife, Alice Dubois. And they remained married, you know, until he passed away in 1993. She lived until 2012. I like going to online obituaries and reading the comments, and there were some really, really amazing comments. Talk about someone who was just loved, and people had this, you know, just absolutely endless amount of respect for was Alice Hood. So I did want that to kind of get out there before I forgot. Now we're going to move kind of quickly a little bit of a distance here because I want to get us to some of the big names on the tour. Thank you. All right. I have to read this quote because this is one of the more humorous quotes in the pantheon here, and I haven't read a lot of them, so hopefully you'll indulge me here for a second. All right, we're well past him. All right, so we're now up to the grave. Now we're at the grave here of Maurice Payette. Okay, now Maurice Payette, his family lived in two homes on Sarah Avenue, 27 and 30 Sarah Avenue. So he either lived right next door to Jack, who lived at 35 Sarah Avenue, or right across the street from him. And there's this amazing sequence in his book, Dr. Sachs, where Jack meets like this superhero witch doctor kind of imaginary friend figure, Dr. Sachs. The first time he actually meets him and they introduce, they're standing at kind of the east end of Phoebe Avenue on the sandbank, and then Dr. Sachs and Jack together do a tour of all the neighbors' backyards as they're going down the street. And Jack would do this, by the way, dressed up with a cape and a slouch hat at the time. Now, he calls himself the Black Thief in Dr. Sachs, but the real name of the character, which is not quite as dramatic, is the Silver Tin Can, because Jack used to do this thing where he would put little sinister messages in these like a little like soup can and throw it through someone's window. And I can't, you know, he was an eccentric kid. So anyhow, so Dr. Sachs is not just this imaginary character, but it's also kind of an externalization of a lot of Jack's kind of, you know, really kind of very, very creative mind. When they're doing this tour down the street, they cross the street because they're getting ready to kind of, you know, go to another section of the city. One of the houses they pass is that of what he calls the Paquin family. He renames them Paquin in the book. The Paquin brothers, who in this case are Maurice and his brother Gerald, who's buried in a different cemetery nearby us here. This is how Jack describes them, and I love this description, that's why I'm going to read it. Paquin brothers were Beef and Robert, so one of them is nicknamed Beef. Here's Beef. Big Beef of the ass waddling down the street. There's an image for you, okay? And neither of these guys was, you know, like over 170, 180 pounds, so I'm not sure how much ass waddling was actually going on. Robert was a freckled, earnest giant, good intention with all, nothing wrong with Beef either. Freckled too, good-natured. My mother says she was sitting on the porch one evening and Beef came out with the moon to talk to her. Told her his deepest secrets about how he wanted to go out and enjoy nature as far as he was concerned. Now, I don't know if he ever got to do that. Maurice was, in fact, a plumber. He spent his life toiling, very solid, kind of working class job. married, had a large family like the family he came from. He had several other brothers and sisters who were also part of Jack's kind of play group. I happened to communicate with the next generation down, and what was interesting, and you will find this in lots of the cases of these stories I'm telling you, the people mentioned in Jack's books didn't read Jack's books. So none of them knew that Jack had immortalized them as characters in, Dr. Sachs or Visions of Girard. So some of them are not only shocked to find this out. Now, one of the more interesting cases, when I was corresponding with one of the Fournier family kids, or a grandkid in this case, this woman was shocked. She was like, wait, my father was Jack Kerouac's best friend? I said, yeah. Like, during his early years, I said, his boon companion was, and I got pictures of him in here, it was Mike Fournier. And she goes, hold on a second, I got to look this up. So I'm talking with this woman on the phone, and she gets on the internet and she starts looking, and I hear her kind of shout an expletive, like, holy, in the background. And she's like, I just found my father's name in his biography about Jack Kerouac. She's like, can I call you right back? So she told me she got on the phone and started calling all of her friends to tell them that her father was famous, and she never knew. So we didn't even like to talk about my father because, there was something about he had an affair outside the marriage and all that. And it was like, I got way more information that day than I wanted. But what is so interesting, though, is that so many of the people who are going to exist in literature for all eternity, as long as books exist, a lot of them didn't know. And when they discovered, they're like, but what was so special about me that anyone would want to write about me? Jack thought these were the most interesting people in the world, which is why he says time and time again, my favorite books are about people I grew up with. That's why I wish more people read them. So anyhow, Big Beef. Because I know some of you can do this sort of thing, you can sort of multitask. Right behind us on the ground here is the grave of someone named Robert Tessier. Anyone recognize that name? Yep. Yeah. If you go to IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, and type that name in, you're going to find quite a long filmography for Robert Tessier. He's one of the most famous motion picture actors to ever come out of the city of Lowell. He played kind of prescribed, kind of tough guy roles. He had a very interesting appearance. He was of mixed Native American heritage, so he oftentimes was kind of relegated to playing those roles that I don't think he ever maybe got to really show his acting talent. But I've seen enough of his films to know that he definitely had a screen presence. Okay. Now,
he was the original Longest Yard. He played a...
That's right. That's right. The Burt Reynolds film, The Longest Yard, if you've ever seen that.
Oh, wow.
But also, he was a Army paratrooper. He was awarded a Bronze Star in Korea.
He was born on the day that Girard died.
Very interesting guy.
But I think maybe something a little more, Hollywood or something. But I think it speaks to the working class stage. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Saint Jean. This is the grave of Guillaume Saint Jean's. Guillaume Saint Jean was father to 10 children. Okay, he ran a pool parlor in Centerville on Aiken Street in the early decades of the 20th century, and all of his sons ended up becoming very, very adept pool players. One in particular was, for a period of time, one of the greatest billiards players in the world. Now, he played for the 1928 World Championship against his drinking buddy, Ralph Greenleaf. And this is how important the match was. Partway through, they had to post a story about how they were doing, because the folks in Lowell absolutely had to know how their native son, Andrew St. Jean, was doing. So Ralph Greenleaf, pocket billiard champion today, leads Andrew St. Jean by a score of 503 to 390. As much as I know about pool, still sounds like a pretty close score to me. Well, Andrew St. Jean, after his family moved to Pawtuckettville, and here's a picture of him. I have about a 25-year archive of his exploits playing pool around the world. Jack Kerouac describes him, in fact, renames him St. Louis in Dr. Sachs, and has this incredibly vivid description of him coming into the Pawtucketville Social Club, which was the kind of French-Canadian social club that his father managed for a time, coming in there to play pool with the locals. And they would just kind of stand back in awe. In fact, he was, in addition to being a great billiards player, a great hustler too, because he would go in places and he would take on all comers. He says, you know, I'll play with one hand. In fact, he was near impossible to beat, you know, either way, because he had mastered the art of one hand. I don't know how someone does that, but he had incredible peripheral vision. He was very, very long-limbed. Jack's descriptions of him are such that he's like, he's almost kind of mysterious. It's like almost like a gunslinger that comes to town, kind of does his thing, you know. Everybody lies dead around the pool table, and then he leaves. He had that kind of reputation. Now, he was also an early, sports endorsement person, I guess you could say, because Andrew St. John would don a costume and become the masked marvel. He would go into clubs, and it was a promotion for the Coca-Cola Corporation. So he'd go in town, drum up interest, play a few, get everybody, like they give out sample bottles of Coke, but hopefully they would kind of brand stamp people so that they would come back to, in fact, that product later on. So he did that to kind of make ends meet when he wasn't either hustling or on the pro billiards tour. So in Dr. Sachs, Jack names him St. Louis, but his nickname is the Shadow. If you know anything about the Shadow was a pulp novel and kind of comic book character in the 1930s and 1940s. Jack used to religiously read Shadow cartoons or Shadow books, and here is one. The Shadow was a direct influence on his character of Dr. Sachs. By the way, they did an audiobook version, kind of full, a multi kind of voice performance of it. Now, if you can see, there's pretty strong kind of correspondence between these two things here. So, guys, for a period of time, the greatest pool player, or one of the greatest pool players in the world, came from Lowell. He shared with Jack Kerouac another unfortunate trait in that he liked to drink, and ultimately he died from cirrhosis of the liver in his early 50s. So there's no special marker, anything of the sort for him here, nothing to indicate that one of the greatest pool players in the world at the time is buried in this rather humble kind of family plot. So, A-J-O-I-E. There was a great American baseball player named Napoleon Lajoie. Okay, so Jack renames him Lajoie in his book, Dr. Sachs, and he's one of the few characters that I know of who in fact is mentioned in the book not because of the person he is, but because of a scent that he represented. Jack has a great eye, ear, nose for sensory details. When he was a kid, he used to be able to smell the lumber. Okay, Ernest Lagasse made his living. He had a lumber yard and he sold coal. But the smell of his lumber yard, which was only about 100 yards, 150 yards as the crow flies from Jack's house to where he had his lumber yard, the smell of that was so indelible to Jack that he in fact name drops Ernest Lagasse in one of his books, which is kind of neat. Think about that. It's like you're memorable for a smell you produce. Well, a good smell you produce. That didn't come across the way I wanted it to, so I'm going to leave it there before I get into more trouble. This is one of those cases where you go, if somebody had wanted to toot his horn a little bit, like, here's what a great person I was in life, and have a more magnificent, you know, maybe even gaudy headstone, E. Gaston Campbell was a person who should have been able to do that. This guy's story, and by the way, this is Mr. Campbell, and here is an ad from a resident directory here in Lowell where it says he's an auctioneer, real estate, and insurance salesman. He had offices in the Hildreth building on both the second and third floor, depending on the year you kind of look up. But this guy, as self-made men go, is pretty spectacular. He started off as a draftsman. He mastered that skill. He ultimately became a real estate person. He sold insurance. I think this is how he and Jack Kerouac's father, Leo, ultimately met. And in one of my favorite instances here, and this is information my friend Dick Howe here brought to my attention by some research he did on my behalf, having to do with the homes that Jack lived in. At one point in time, E. Gaston Campbell owned a house on Burnaby Street in Lowell that Jack Kerouac and his family would later live in. I think they probably got the lead on that house through Leo's friendship with Gaston. This guy was so popular. He was, again, every possible ethnic kind of social org, he was part of it. He served in kind of executive roles in a lot of those clubs. In fact, he was pushed to try to actually run for state senator, and he declined that because he had his fingers in so many different business opportunities. So he gets mentioned in Jack Kerouac's book, Visions of Girard, and I like to read this one because this is very poignant stuff, but in addition to being quite the businessman himself, Jack Kerouac's father, Leo, liked to tip back a few every now and then, and that's basically what's going on here, but it's going on in the context of Gerard Kerouac's illness, which also ultimately would take his life in 1926. So it says here, my father, Leo Kerouac, en route home, stops for a quick drink himself in the company of his old friend, Gaston MacDonald, who has a spanking 1922 Stutz parked outside. And with him is Manuel. Manuel was a man who worked alongside Leo Kerouac at Spotlight Print, whose usual courtesy of driving Pa home tonight in the sidecar motorcycle. So Manuel had a sidecar motorcycle, and they decide, let's not take that because, as Jack said, the sidecar motorcycle has been set aside in favor of the Stutz, and besides, it's too cold, and besides, they're so high now, the motorcycle trip would have been a fatality. Drink, Emile, amuse yourself, damn it, it's Christmas. This is what Gaston Campbell's saying. And Leo says, not for me, Gaston. With my little Gerard in bed, it's not a hell of a pretty Christmas. Makes one appearance in all of Jack's books. He's, in fact, in a couple of history guides. There's a really nice book about kind of historic presences from Draycote, and he gets an entry in there. So this guy was kind of a big deal. And again, says something to his kind of humility here, that he has a very, very modest headstone, which doesn't have any kind of, you know, special accomplishments or on it or anything like that. Okay, so we're making our way to two trees over here. We're going to go this way. Victor Sawyer. Now, Vic Sawyer was another one of Jack's kind of playmates when he was a kid. It's a nice picture of him right here. Here's Vic. There's Vic and his lovely bride, Rita Aubin. For those of you who are trying to snap pictures, see the picture I'm looking for? Yeah. And this is how he would have looked when Jack knew him. This is Vic Sawyer on the Aiken All-Stars baseball team. He's right here under my thumb, okay? Now, part of the reason I like to stop here, not only did he live just around the corner from Jack, yeah, they played sports together, and you know, yeah, they were buddies, but I need to tell you something about his father, who, by the way, his father's name is Josephat. Josephat. Josephat Sawyer. That is a name that sticks in the craw. He was making his own wine, and he stored, like, he had hundreds of bottles of it in the basement of his home. One of Jack's first bits of exposure to drinking came when his good friend Vic said, hey Jack, you're never going to believe what my dad has down in the basement. So they would sneak down there, sip a little bit from a few bottles, and this lasted for long enough that Josephat, the father, finally figured some of the bottles were coming up a little short, so he started locking that door. So for all of the talk about Jack's drinking, and it started, you know, with the publication of his books and his heavy, I think Jack was probably drinking with a lot of his friends because they had like pool halls and places they liked to go where there was drinking going on. It was what working class men did at the time. And one of them was Vic Sawyer. Now, I do need to share this. Now, in the same picture here with Vic Sawyer, I should have showed this first, okay, is this young man right here on the far left. His name is Arthur Lozeau. Arthur Lozeau was the first young man from Pawtucketville who was killed in World War II. Okay? He was part of Jack's play group. He played on sandlot baseball teams with him. And this is actually something that Jack wrote in a letter to Stella Sampis, who would become his last wife. But he's writing this in 1952, 14 years before he marries her. He says, the loss of people like Sammy meaning Sebastian Sammy Sampis, who was in fact his wife's younger brother. The loss of people like Sammy, who died, Anzio, and Johnny Kumancelis, who died in a plane crash, okay, in training, Jimmy Scondras, who died at Iwo Jima, makes the earth bleed and kills something. Billy Chandler, who's probably the closest person other than Sammy on this list, he died on the Bataan Death March. Chuck Lozeau, that was his nickname, Chuck. So many were killed from Lowell for nothing. So early on, when Jack used to express sentiments like that, people were, he's like some kind of anti-war person. Jack was embraced by the counterculture a lot, but Jack always held on to some very, very conventional values. So even if you see him like denouncing war, and Jack didn't like the idea of war, like, you know, any more than any, you know, I'm assuming sane person does, but it really seemed pointless to him when he thinks about like some of the very best young men in the city. And by the way, Jimmy Scondras was going to become either a Major League Baseball player or an NFL football player. He was so talented. He was going to an Ivy League school playing, you know, Division I sports. By the way, he and his brother both died within a few months of one another. They're buried next to one another in I believe it's West Lawn Cemetery, which is sad stuff, but the truth about what happened all too often to Jack's generation. Now, the Noel family lived in the Rosemont district in Pawtucketville, which was completely decimated by the 1936 flood. I won't spend much time here other than to say one of the more memorably eccentric characters to come in any of Jack's books is a young man named Omer X. Noel. Omer X. Noel is renamed Zaza, Z-A-Z-A, Voracel in Jack's books. Now he does some things that are not fit to share in mixed company. He was known for being a little more advanced in ways of the flesh than some of the other young men were, but he was kind of a hanger-on in Jack's group, and he was known to do whatever one of Jack's other friends, a gentleman named Fred Bertrand, he's called Vinnie Bergerac. If Vinnie Bergerac told me, say, hey Zaza, go to the top 4 floors, go to the top of that 4-story tenement and jump down on your head, he likely would have done it. So he gets kind of a dark reputation from Jack's books, and even in his correspondence they go back and forth. And when Jack had left to go to Columbia University, or Horace Mann to go to school, the neighborhood kids would still write about Zaza. I said, you're not going to believe what Zaza did today. And most of what Zaza did was pretty awful.
Kurt, don't you get the impression that he was simple-minded in some way, what would have been called simple-minded?
Jack actually says in the book that ultimately he was committed to an asylum.
Oh.
I happen to know a few kind of personal details about his later life that I think explains why he said that. I don't think he was insane. I think there was something else going on. I don't think there was any kind of mental illness. Well, let's put it this way. What was wrong with him would have been considered a mental illness at the time. We would no longer consider it a mental illness now, if that clarifies anything for you.
Was his mom Eva? Or
I know his father was named Samuel. I don't remember his mother's name, but
like
I would.
or
There were so many. LeBlanc was a pretty common name, so I would bet that's probably not it. It doesn't sound familiar, but I could be wrong. Guys, let me see. Purple Heart, the Good Conduct Medal, the Presidential Unit Citation, the American Defense Service Medal, the Foreign Service Clasp, the American Campaign Medal, the Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, the Bronze Star, the World War II Victory Medal, and at the time of his wife's death, Phoebe Voyer was still trying to get the Prisoner of War citation that she felt her husband, Joseph Voyer, deserved. Joseph Voyer, as those of you who were here early on heard, was a survivor of the Bataan Death March. He spent 3 years and 4 months in Japanese captivity. Harrowing, doesn't begin to describe it. His wife said that he would wake up in the middle of the night screaming in Japanese, decades after his experiences in the camp. It's about 185, 190 pounds. You know, in his football playing days, he played sandlot football with Jack. Jack calls him the Big Bull Al Didier instead of Joseph Voyer. He was 70 pounds when he was liberated from Bataan. Okay, so he suffered mightily. What did he do when he came back to Lowell? Joe Voyer had seen all of the filth and darkness and violence he ever could possibly want to see in life, so he became a florist. He went to Boston, studied the art of it. Roses were his specialty. He had a tremor in his hand. Said, and the only time, his wife said, you know, and I'm hoping this isn't apocryphal, she said the only time the tremor wasn't pronounced in his hand is when he was actually creating settings of roses. Roses were his specialty. So he had flowers by Voyer on Merrimack Street on both the 600 and 700 blocks for decades. In fact, the business only came to an end when his son, Richard, who'd taken over the business, died in 1993. They decided to sell, and it's since disappeared. Now, when he died of a massive heart attack in 1989, all of those medals I mentioned to you, he hadn't been given any of those. Because of some bureaucratic error, he never received any of his medals. And when somebody asked him about him one time, one of his best friends was Robert Hood, who survived 7 months in a German Stalag. He said, "Why haven't you gotten your medals?" He says, "I don't want to remember that time. No, I've no interest in it." So Joe Voyer went his entire life with no formal acknowledgement by the United States government of his heroic sacrifice. And by the way, he was an Air Force tail gunner. His plane came in for a landing in an airfield, an airstrip that had been overrun by the Japanese. They didn't know it at the time. So that's where he got captured. He managed to get away. He swam to another island from where he was actually captured, called Corregidor, where he was recaptured. Now, his wife always said the best preparation Joe ever had for one of his later avocations, he served on the Lowell Election Commission. Says he learned the fine art of bargaining. Okay, he said because he literally one time he was whistling like Yankee Doodle, and he got a severe beating for that, and was told don't ever do that again here. Nothing pro-American. I mean, they tried to strip them of their identity. But his wife said his best preparation for being Lowell Election Commissioner was the time he spent in Bataan, because he learned the fine art of really subtle diplomacy. I don't know. Kind of awful, but makes a really kind of, sixth sense if you think about it. So, pretty modest grave for a pretty incredible human being. Now, I've corresponded with the family, and I got some really nice photos of just him having a gathering. Now, by the way, Phoebe, who used to be Phoebe Ferris, she'd already lost a wife. Her first husband died in World War II, and she and Joe met after World War II at a benefit dance. And as she describes it, she said this handsome-looking man walked in, and he'd largely recovered from his war experiences. This was in 1946, and he winked at her. And she said, back then, she said, that meant everything. So they were married just a few months later. But she was the repository for his stories and fought like crazy to get the recognition and all the medals he deserved. But she has great stories about their early days together, and especially how active their social lives were. They lived right on Phoebe Avenue for a good long while. In fact, he was interviewed at his house by Jerry Nicosia for his biography, and he had some really, really thoughtful, interesting things to say about Kerouac. And Phoebe does also. She was like, oh, Kerouac, she says, his eyes. Oh, his eyes. And all the men are in the background laughing and said, you know, should we leave the room or something, you know, while you're talking? It's very, very cute, but I'm thinking, every time I see one of those photographs of him smiling, holding a drink up, and I'm going, man, how much harder was the work of smiling for him after the kind of experience he had? So, neighborhood needs at least one cranky old man. And in Jack's neighborhood, when he lived on Phoebe Avenue, that cranky old man was a gentleman named Alphonse Noel. Now, he was a mill worker. He came to the States. He immigrated from Canada. He got here right at the start of the 20th century, and his first appearance in the Lowell Sun is to report that he had, and I want to make sure that I get this right, Alphonse Noel brought a little sickness with him from Canada. In fact, the sickness was, here we go, okay, smallpox. Okay. So on the front page of the Lowell Sun, one of the first days in the year 1900, Alphonse Noel, who just come to Lowell, made the Lowell Sun because he had smallpox, and they were talking about trying to like nip this thing in the bud. So anyhow, he came from Saint Apollinaire, Quebec. He was a resident of Lowell for 35 years. In fact, Jack didn't witness his death, but Jack witnessed the after, and the after story of his death. Now, it turns out one night when Jack and his friends were out playing in the street, they were throwing a ball around. This cranky old man, okay, comes out and said, you boys, stop making all that noise out there. I'm going to go and tell, I mean, you know, scared the boys. They all went around. It's like, what the heck's wrong with that guy? Well, that guy was Alphonse Noel. Jack writes about this in Dr. Sachs. And he says, in a short time later, I saw 6 people carrying Alphonse Noel's body out of his house after he died. You know, it's in the body bag. And Jack remembers very vividly the weather when that happened. It was kind of a gloomy, rainy morning. He remembers the sound that the men who were carrying the body at their feet made. So Alphonse Noel makes an appearance in one of Jack's books, not for anything that's particularly nice. Again, he was kind of a cranky old man. But the fact of his death in March of 1935 has been immortalized in books by Jack Kerouac. And there's part of me, I was like, why would he like do that? And he renames the character Delorme, D-E-L-O-R-M-E. So he disguises some of the names better than others. And that's one I think he probably didn't necessarily want anyone to talk about. But Jack witnessed death so frequently when he was living in Pawtucketville, like not the same kind of intensity of death he witnessed when his brother died, but lots of instances of death. So this is yet another one of the people who died in Jack's presence that left a lasting impression on him. So much so that an event that happened in 1935, Jack could recall vividly 17 years later when he was sitting on the toilet in William S. Burroughs' bathroom in Mexico City writing Dr. Sachs, that he could actually conjure that image up and use it in his book. And it helps reinforce the kind of Gothic atmosphere. Now, guys, the last stop we're going to make here, unfortunately, doesn't have a grave marker. This section has some of the more, some people might call them disreputable. I like to say they're eccentric characters. But when Jack was a kid, he had a favorite candy store that he used to like to go to. And that candy store was owned by someone named, if I can find the picture, Not a great picture, folks, but it's the best I got. Joseph Joe Desjardins. Now, Desjardins was renamed Détouche. So if you've ever read Dr. Sachs and Jack starts talking about Détouche's candy store, he says, I didn't like the nice little candy store on the corner run by that really nicely manicured woman. He says, we like gloomy, tromping, gray candy stores like this guy's. Now, he developed a reputation, and lots of unflattering stories were shared about Joe Desjardins because, well, he was nearsighted, had very roomy kind of eyes, okay? He had a shuffling gait because he had problems with his feet, okay? And he also spoke with a pronounced lisp that literally, you know, decades after he died, when Lowellians would get together and tell stories, they would still be mocking his lisp decades later. So Jack used to like to go, and this is that very store. It's on Old Moody Street, what was then Textile Avenue, now University Avenue. If you've ever eaten at Suppa's, the sandwich shop, literally right across the street from there, it used to be a brick bank building, is exactly where this candy store was. Jack writes about this guy more than he writes about some of the famous poets and other writers that he hung out with, because this guy created a lasting impression on. By the way, that's Raymond Desjardins in the middle, that's Joe's son. But when he died, people were like, you know, you heard the story about what he did, right? And you're like, oh, he really did that? And Jack says, in Dr. Sachs, all of that stuff was just cruel gossip, okay? None of it was true, but it's what people said about him in the neighborhood. So in those little insular, kind of cloistered Franco-American neighborhoods, you could have some pretty vicious gossip. And I don't know if that's one of the reasons why Joe Desjardins, who was actually a rather successful businessman, he was a member of the Pawtucketville Businessmen's Association, but I wonder if that's why he doesn't have a stone to this day. Because I would think that he probably warrants one, but there you go. I have a handful of people we can do down here. I think I'm just gonna cherry pick a couple of them on our way back down to our final spot. One I absolutely had to go to was this grave. This is Joseph Roland Salvis, who was one of Jack's two very, very best friends during his adolescence in Pawtucketville. He was a communications specialist in the Navy during, it was in the Navy during World War II. And Jack gives him another one of his more vivid nicknames. He calls him Lauzon instead of Salva or Salvis, and his nickname for him is Lousy. Okay. And I don't think he had an infestation. I think it was just a way to kind of bust his chops. But he could be incredibly thoughtful, soulful, and he was one of the people who biographers had a very difficult time getting to because he didn't want to talk about Jack. He didn't like a lot of the things that were written by Kerouac. He would defend him, but he said, you know, when Jack came back to Lowell in the 1960s, he would stop by your house at 2 o'clock in the morning, knock on the door, just completely drunk off his tail, and want to hang out and discuss old times. And he says, we were working. In fact, he worked for decades at W.R. Grace in Acton, one of the places that's documented in a civil action, okay, because they did all of that kind of environmental defoliation because they were releasing toxins. And that he worked as a shipper there for years and years. Again, very grounded working class guy, but stayed out of the spotlight, didn't want to answer questions about Jack unless he was absolutely convinced that you had Jack's best interest in mind. When Jerry Nicosia got to him, he said, I sense you're different because you want to write about the real Jack. And Jerry Nicosia's book, Memory Babe, talks a lot more about the young Jack, which was the Jack that all of his friends knew and loved. I said, Jack was the most handsome of our group. He was the smartest of our group. He was the most athletic of our group. Like, he was kind of the quiet leader of our group. And what happened to him later, okay, we don't want to talk badly about him, but his best friends, and Roland Salvis was one of his best friends, defended him right to the end. And sadly, okay, some of them, in fact, I've also conversed with a member of his family, one of his children, and she's no more interested in talking about Jack's relationship with her dad, she said, because most of the time people you'll say something and people will take it out of context or they'll distort what you're saying to create this unpleasant image of Jack. And I like, not only do I really respect his honorability, but he's a character that if you read Jack's books, you can see how loving his descriptions, Jack's descriptions are of Roland, because his sense of humor. It's like, by the way, Jack said you never wanted to pick a fight with him, he says, because he was like the dirtiest fighter, he said, but it was all in good fun. So some of Jack's antics with these friends in his adolescence in Pawtucketville are some of my absolute favorite writing of Jack's, just because it's so joyous and it's clear he was having such a good time. So, all right, let's start making. Joseph Soucy.
I mean, there's definitely pros and cons with that.
Yeah.
But Lowell's pretty awesome.
As I've already alluded to, Little Canada was raised in the 1960s, so a lot of the vibrant kind of Franco-American culture, from the tenements to the markets to all of the bars, they had a huge number of bars there. I mean, you had the kind of population density that you had in very few places in the United States of America, like the Lower East Side in New York City, you know, that was kind of comparable in the kind of population density. One of Jack's favorite places to go in Little Canada was a pool hall that he called Club Paysan, okay? A kind of club for the common man. And the owner of that place was a gentleman named Joseph Soucy. Joseph Soucy gets an incredibly vivid description in not one, but 3 of Jack's books. That's how memorable it was. So friends like Roland Salvis, G.J. Apostolos, Freddie Bertrand used to go there and play pool. The place was an absolute dump. Now, Soucy was a mill worker, okay? You know, he was a loom fixer. I mean, he did other work, but his real love was this little crappy little pool hall that existed basically just behind the tenements, right next door to the old Laurier baseball park there. So Jack's descriptions of him are vivid. He said, you know, he was 90 years old. He was the most perfect bow legs you'd ever saw. And he constantly had a handkerchief at his nose because his nose always seemed to be running. That was partly because it was never well heated in there. He probably, you know, perpetually had a cold. So this guy with this very modest grave, who, by the way, lived to be 95 years old. Jack describes him, by the way, in the 1930s as looking 90 years old. And he still had almost another 30 years of living going on. So I can't imagine what Joe Soucy looked like at that stage. Okay, folks, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention at least once or twice, you know, the 1936 flood that took place in Lowell, where great sections of the city, particularly sections over in lower kind of western Pawtucketville, the Rosemont district, Centreville was absolutely inundated. One of the reasons ultimately the Kerouacs had to leave Lowell was that Leo Kerouac's print shop sustained an enormous amount of damage in 1936, and he wasn't able to pay back the $3,000 loan, private loan that he'd taken out from a friend, caused some real serious issues between them. So the 1936 flood precipitated lots of bad things for the Kerouacs. Now notice 2 dead as flood reaches peak here. Governor pays visit, guards on patrol. 2 dead as flood reaches peak here. Now, if you've never seen pictures of the 1936 flood, now this is insane to me. This is the old Moody Street Bridge. The undergirdings that support that water is literally licking those. Normally those are about 25 or 30 feet above the level of the water. The Merrimack River rose, it was over 20 feet above the level of the Pawtucket Dam, the Pawtucket Falls Dam. And if you know anything about that, you're going, that's kind of, I almost can't visualize it. Well, it was severe enough that you had lots of property damage. But the story I want to tell you now is about a boy who drowned in the 1936 flood. There were 3 casualties, okay, in the 1936 flood, okay. One fellow dropped dead of a heart attack while being rescued. Another fell out of the rescue boat, but the third is the most tragic one, and the grave of this boy is right here. His name is Hervé Marin. He lived on Melvin Street in Little Canada. He lived basically overlooking the Merrimack River. And here's an article that was written about his death. And to give you a sense of the kind of geography here, you have the old Moody Street Bridge crossing. Alfie lived here, but he was hanging out right about here, doing, of all things, trying to collect driftwood from the water. And how he was trying to collect driftwood has got to be one of those classic Darwin Awards kind of things. He had a long stick with a barb on the end attached to a piece of rope he had tied around his waist. He managed to spear a piece of wood, but the water was going at probably in excess of 60 miles an hour. He got caught, pulled into the water, drowned. A little boy named Ronald Nault saw him go into the water, and he's the only eyewitness we have to this. Alfie Marin's body was found, I believe, a couple of days later, over by the kind of confluence of the Merrimack and Beaver Brook over there. So he's one of only 3 casualties. Now, why bring him up here? Well, Jack writes about the flood. No, Jack actually writes about Alfie Marin. He renames him Roger Voyer. He borrows names from other characters, but Jack also liked to give them by the same syllable count in his name. Roger Voyer, you got the whole thing here. And he talks about it. Oh, did you hear? He has this conversation between 2 locals saying, "Did you hear about the Voyer boy?" It's like, "Oh yeah, Roger." He says, "I heard he drowned over there in Beaver Brook." We didn't drown in Beaver Brook. He drowned on the other side of the river. He was found at Beaver Brook. So his is one of those stories that, but for Jack immortalizing it, this young man would be completely forgotten. And one of the most catastrophic natural disasters that happened in the entire northeastern part of the United States. Oh, and by the way, 2 years later, Lowell had the great hurricane of 1938, which actually did as much, if not more, destruction, including tearing down a big tree right across from Jack's house that he also writes about in his book, Dr. Sax. So a book like Dr. Sax, which is all about Jack's fanciful recollections of his boyhood, also it's filled with a lot of valuable history. All right, folks, let's just 2 more and then we're done here. Yes, right here. Jack Kerouac's best friend growing up in Centerville was a young man named Michael or Michelle Fournier. Okay, Michelle Fournier is not buried here, but his parents are. Worth pointing out that the Fourniers, in fact, also make appearances in every single one of Jack's Lowell books. And Michelle Fournier, Sr., was Leo Kerouac's best friend. Jack Kerouac's family was very thoroughly integrated into their little St. Louis parish growing up, so they were involved in lots of church functions and fundraising. In fact, they had a group that was originally called the Jolly 14, that later became the Dirty Dozen, which gives a slightly different spin to maybe some of their activity. But they were just a social group, okay? And a lot of what they did was get together, party, drink, have a good time. They weren't doing anything kind of out of the ordinary, but they first met during the 25th anniversary, the silver anniversary fundraising efforts for the St. Louis de France parish, which they were all part of at the time. So Michelle Fournier, in fact, is in all of Jack's Lowell books. And if I can get my tablet to turn back on here, there we go. This is another of my favorite quotes. In The Town and the City, Jack talks about his father's death, which actually happened in 1946. And he has this poignant description of people gathering in Lowell and then in Nashua for his father's funeral. And one of the people who comes there is Michel Fournier and his family. He renames him Joseph Cartier, okay? So if you hear Joe Cartier, I'm talking about Michel Fournier. Anyhow, the passage says, "The great crowd of friends from Galloway," that's Lowell, was a joy and a solace that tore at their hearts, meaning the hearts of Jack's family. Old Joe Cartier arrived with his entire family, a gay, raucous troupe that had enlivened many a party in the old Martin house on holidays. Kerouac had renamed his family Martin in the town and the city. To see them lunging in one after another with earnest, troubled looks of pain and regret, to see their true sadness, their perturbation, their loss, was a sight to warm the soul. Old Cartier had not changed a bit. He was still the big, sturdy man who had been Martin's lifelong crony, still the red-faced, stolid, white-haired old-timer with the powerful, bulging stare of unbendable determination, still loyal, still unbending in his feelings. So the Fourniers were incredibly important to Jack, and in fact, when Jack and his family moved to Pawtucketville, very shortly thereafter did the Fourniers, who lived on Salem Street. All right, folks, we've only got one more stop. I'll make it the last one. So for those of you who've been waiting to see something as close to the Kerouac family genealogy as you can, well, that's where we're going for last. Stone here, and there's also his military stone up there. So folks, Jack Kerouac is buried in Edson Cemetery, not too far from here, with his the family of his last wife. His parents are buried in Nashua, New Hampshire, as is his beloved brother Gerard. Most people feel like Jack probably should have been buried in Nashua with his family, but I won't get into the controversy there. It's kind of a can of worms. Or he could be buried here and he'd be alongside family, because this is the grave of Jack's first cousin, Hervé Kerouac. Hervé Kerouac is Leo's brother Joseph's middle son. What kinds of things was he good at? He was a star athlete, just like Jack. He was a member of basically every single social club and kind of Franco-American group in Lowell. His daughter, Terry, who I'd hope might be here today, but again, she had just had surgery, told me, she says, oh, my dad had a beautiful voice, and I finally found a Lowell Sun article that mentions that he took solos when he sang for the CMAC choir, okay? So he had a lovely singing voice. He earned a Purple Heart and a number of battle medals. He was injured in Germany, World War II. And most touchingly for me, and this is the stuff I want to show you here. Here's Hervé here. There's a pretty strong resemblance to Jack. I mean, this is a kind of a fuzzy picture, but he was part of a bowling league in 1938, Eno's Printing, okay? He was actually a better baseball player than Jack was, because he could actually hit a curveball and Jack couldn't, okay? This ran in L'Etoile, the local Franco-American French-Canadian paper, after Hervé was injured in Germany in November of 1944. This was sent to me by the granddaughter of the owner of L'Etoile. This is a beautiful picture of Hervé and his lovely bride Doris, okay? Of course, she's buried here with him. Here's a later picture of the two of them. But the pictures I most like showing people, and these are whatever kind of family issues there were with the Kerouacs. And look, not everyone in the Kerouac family liked who Jack became, but when Jack got together with family, he was his old self. Here's a picture right in the background. You can barely see him. There's Jack with Doris, Hervé, Hervé's son Paul, and Armand. Now, Armand wasn't quite as thrilled with Jack, because he knew of his reputation, especially his reputation for drinking and carousing, okay? Here's a picture of Jack with his Aunt Leontine, by the way, Leontine is parents, Hervé's mother, okay? And they're probably talking about something written in Franco-American and French Canadian, because when he conversed and wrote letters to her, all of them are in French. The only member of Jack Kerouac's family who served in his funeral was Hervé Kerouac. Now, this is a picture of Jack's coffin being placed in the hearse after they've left St. Jean Baptiste Church on Merrimack Street. Now, look at his facial expression there. That's a pained expression. And it's got to be one of the oddest collections of pallbearers. Okay, you got Billy Kumancelis, who was Jack's kind of bodyguard in the last years of his life. Joe Chaput, who was sort of his remaining connection to the Franco-American community. But then you had Allen Ginsberg with his long beard and his kind of bald head, very, very 60s counterculture looking. Tony Sampas, okay, member of the Sampas family, okay. But the lone member of Jack's family at his funeral is Hervé. And in fact, here's Hervé carrying a floral arrangement while Allen Ginsberg films, okay. So, as we end here, I did want to say, as you'll notice from the gravestone, it was only a year and a half later that Hervé himself passed. One of the reasons Jack so loved spending time with Hervé, he did for a living one of the things that Jack, I think, fancied that he wanted to do. And one of those things was like work for the railroad. Jack worked as a brakeman for a period of time on railroads on the West Coast, but he actually worked for the Boston and Maine Railroad. It says it somewhere in here, as a turntable operator. He was the person who redirected the trains and kind of put them on whatever direction they were going. And Jack had an enormous amount of respect for that. So it's kind of sad. But his first cousin, who served as his pallbearer, joined him in the afterlife less than 2 years later. So folks, I've done an awful lot of talking, and for those of you who've lasted through all of it, thank you very much for coming. Please, please, please attend other events today. There are wonderful lectures going on. We're doing other walking tours. I have at least 2 more walking tours that I'll be doing, one on Saturday and one on Sunday. I'll actually be around for 2.